My name is John Oberheide. I'm a PhD student at the University of Michigan. I'm currently studying some virtualization techniques, and I've been looking into live migration recently. And today we're going to talk about the security, or more appropriately lack thereof, of virtual machine migrations. As a disclaimer at the beginning, this is only a turbo talk, so it will be about 20-25 minutes. We have a whole lot of slides to get through and a whole lot of content to cover, so I'm going to be going at a pretty quick pace. Hopefully we can whip through it pretty quickly, though, so that we can head over to the other track and catch the end of that presentation. So we'll begin with the introduction to virtual machine migration. I'm going to make the leap and assume that most of you are familiar, at least on basic levels, with virtualization technology. If you're not, then hopefully you can follow along or catch up later. But we'll go through a brief introduction to how and why migration is used in a virtualized environment. So simply put, the migration of a virtual machine is the transfer of a machine from one physical machine to another physical machine with hopefully a little or no service downtime. So in our nice little diagram here provided by VMware, thank you, we have a virtual machine which contains an applications and the OS moving between two physical machines with their vMotion technology. This enables several advantages. High availability is one of the primary advantages. If you have a physical machine that has faulty or failing components and you need to take it down for maintenance, you can simply move all the virtual machines off it to another physical machine, perform the maintenance, such as replacing a faulty fan, and move the virtual machines back onto it when the maintenance is complete. And doing this, you can preserve your availability for the services hosted by that VM. In addition, in more advanced virtualization systems, you can do load balancing. If you have several physical machines and each of them are running a number of virtual machines, you can have intelligent balancing based on the resource needs and consumption of those virtual machines to obtain better performance or to save money on, you might not need to buy new servers to support these virtual machine services. And at a more personal level, enhanced mobility, you can, if you're working on your desktop and you want to move to your laptop, there's no reason why your workflow should be interrupted. You can simply migrate your entire workspace from your desktop to your laptop and continue working uninterrupted. This model is not very popular since most people don't run virtual machines on their desktop, but in the future I think we'll see more of that as more computing devices become more ubiquitous. You could transfer your virtual machine from your desktop to your laptop to some sort of smaller, more mobile PC without any interruption. To actually perform these migrations, there's several techniques. We have stop and copy, we have demand migration, and we have iterative pre-copy. As you can see on the spectrum here, each has its own advantages. Iterative pre-copy is more of a hybrid method. The goals of migration is to balance both the downtime of the services hosted on the VM while also minimizing the total duration of the migration process. And so iterative pre-copy being the hybrid approach which balances both of these goals is the approach most likely used. But we'll talk a little bit about each method and what its strengths and weaknesses are. The first is stop and copy. It's very straightforward. It's exactly what it sounds like. You stop the source VM, copy all of the working set of memory pages over the network to the destination, and when that's complete, you simply start the destination VM. This results in the shortest migration duration, but also the longest service downtime, since the entire time you're copying all the pages, the services that were hosted on that VM are unavailable. The migration duration is simply limited by the throughput of your network. So if you have a very fast network, this mechanism can actually still only have a downtime on the order of seconds, but that may be unacceptable for certain applications. In the other extreme, we have demand migration, which simply copies over a very small amount of memory, which is only required, the critical OS structures that are required to start the destination VM. And then the remaining pages are simply transferred over when a page fault occurs. So the operating system faults when it is requesting a memory page. The page is copied from the source VMM and is delivered over the network to the destination. This results in the shortest amount of service downtime, but it also has unbounded migration duration since you're only copying the pages that are requested. And the hybrid approach, which we mentioned, iterative pre-copy, balances both of these service downtime and the total duration. And it's the method that's currently used by the popular VMware and Xen hypervisors. It operates by walking through the working set of memory on multiple iterations. Each iteration, you only copy the pages that have been dirtied since the last iteration. So you continually do this, and once you reach a certain threshold defined by either the VMM or an operator, then you decide to stop the source VM, copy the remaining dirty pages, and then resume the destination VMM. So this method is the most effective and the most widely used out there. So now we have a brief introduction to how and why we use virtual machine migration. We can talk about some of the security concerns with it. So if you take a trip down memory lane and go back to the good old days when we actually ran a single operating system on a single physical machine, I know it's hard to believe that we actually did this at some point. The machine state was protected by hardware mechanisms such as the MMU, so physical memory could not be attacked by an attacker unless he had physical access. We've seen attacks such as plugging in a rogue FireWire device and DMAing directly into physical memory. But in general, this was the most secure model. Then virtual machines came along, and suddenly we no longer have this protection by hardware mechanisms, but we have a software layer protecting the state of our operating systems. And we all know that hypervisors aren't perfect, and bugs in them can weaken the isolation between multiple virtual machines. So an attacker with control of one virtual machine may be able to write the state of another virtual machine that's within the same hypervisor. And you might ask yourself at this point, can we actually do any worse? Can we make this more exposed to security problems? Can we break any more isolation boundaries? And the answer, of course, is yes, of course we can, since we always want functionality and we don't care what security risks come along with it. So with our migration-enabled VMs, now our entire VM state is exposed to the network. Any attackers that are listening on the network or have other capabilities now are able to observe the entire state of our VM, which includes the physical working memory. And this is a whole new can of worms that we've opened, and we have to deal with these isolation, confidentiality, and authentication concerns with transferring things over the network. So the entire security of VM migrations hinges on the security of the migration data plane, which is the network transit path over which the migration occurs. If this data plane is insecure or unauthenticated, an attacker may be able to gain full access to the state of the VM, which, as we've mentioned, is the kernel memory, the applications beneath the kernel, and also the data that's being used by these applications. And as we'll see in the rest of this presentation, the migrations performed by Xen and VMware are indeed vulnerable. So in order to take advantage of these insecure migrations used by these popular vendors, we need to be able to manipulate the traffic between the source and destination VMMs. An attacker can do this by performing a man-in-the-middle attack. To gain man-in-the-middle capabilities, there's numerous methods, such as ARP spoofing or DNS poisoning or route hijacking, all depending on the network topology of the attacker's target. Some of the boring attacks you can do are passive attacks. Since your entire working memory is sent over the network, you can obviously snoop out keys and other sensitive information. While your keys might be encrypted on disk, if they're unencrypted into memory and a migration occurs, suddenly your keys are exposed to everyone who happens to be listening on the network. The more interesting attacks are the active ones, which you can manipulate user land processes such as authentication services, or if you want to do some really insidious attacks, you can actually slip rootkits directly into kernel memory while the migration is occurring, resulting in the final restored virtual machine being completely compromised. So now we're going to go into some of the attacks that are possible through these insecure migrations. We developed a tool called Xensploit, which is a simple proof of concept tool implementing a few of these attacks. And despite its name, it works against both Xen and VMware migrations. And as I said, we can perform these attacks against applications, and we can also attack the kernel memory to have more undetectable rootkits. And also, we're going to mention how by mangling the migration, an attacker can actually compromise the entire virtual machine monitor through vulnerabilities in the hypervisor layer. So the two attacks that are implemented by Xensploit are rather simple attacks against applications in user space. The first one is bypassing the authentication routines of SSHD. We can manipulate the routines to allow unrestricted root access during the migration, so that when the VM is restored, an attacker can simply gain root access without having to provide any credentials. The second one is a shellcode injection in the cron daemon, so that the next time the cron daemon wakes up and looks for jobs to execute, it will actually fetch a remote payload and execute it. Cron is a pretty good target for this since it usually is a privileged daemon, and it's also inconspicuous since its primary job is to wake up and launch executables, so it might not raise as many red flags if you perform such an attack. We'll whip through a quick example of the SSH authentication bypass. I don't have any live demos of this presentation, but I suppose I can whip up one of those corny Flash exploitation videos that seems to be all the rage these days. Just have some simple screenshots showing before the migration occurs, an attacker is simply attempting to gain access to this example virtual machine, and since he doesn't have credentials, his access is denied. While the authentication code used by OpenSSH, we have a little screenshot here. Specifically, the user key allowed function right here will return a 1 if the user is allowed to log in with it with a given key. So it's a good target for Zensploit to manipulate by simply changing the in-memory object code of SSHD as it crosses over the wire. Zensploit can identify the SSHD process, isolate the routines of the authentication, and manipulate them so that the user key allowed function always returns true. So after the migration, as expected, the attacker is able to gain root access to this machine without providing any sort of authentication credentials, allowing him super user access and to perform whatever attacks from there he wishes to do. Obviously, these two examples that I gave are simple attacks against userland components. More complex attacks, but much more powerful attacks can be performed against kernel memory, such as slipping in rootkits or backdoors that are triggered by a certain network packet. There's no need to rehash all of the methods that can be used to modify physical memory. All the DMA attacks via FireWire that I've talked about are applicable to this situation. One of the more interesting attacks, and probably the most powerful, is completely hoisting up the virtual machine under a VMBR layer while it's being migrated. For those of you unfamiliar that haven't been to a previous Black Hat and seen all the blue pill fanatics, VMBRs are virtual machine-based rootkits which allow a pseudo-undetectable layer underneath the actual operating system applications to be installed transparently, which makes it much more difficult to detect that some manipulation has happened. So during this migration, an attacker can actually slip a VMBR layer underneath the virtual machine so that when it's restored, it will actually be sitting on top of a malicious hypervisor layer within the actual VMM hypervisor. This nested virtualization is possible using certain combinations of virtualization technologies. Sometimes it's incompatible, but there are situations where this would be possible. And we've seen these VMBR attacks in projects like Subvert or Blue Pill, and they can actually be applied to this situation to come up with very, very powerful attacks. As I mentioned, we can subvert everything from the VMBR layer up, compromising the OS and applications, but it'd be really great if we could actually compromise the lower layer of the virtual machine monitor. And we find that we actually can. Spent a couple hours looking through Zen's virtual machine migration routines, and some pretty crufty code. So if any bug hunters out there want to have some fertile ground to look at, go take a look at those routines. And several vulnerabilities that I found were remotely exploitable, which would cause an attacker to be able to manipulate migration in such a way it would exploit the vulnerability and gain full control over the Zen DOM0 and the associated hypervisor. So if you can own the VMM, then you can obviously own all of the VMs underneath it. And more importantly, all of the virtual machines that are going to be migrated to it in the future. I have a little screenshot here of an example. One of the example vulnerabilities from Zen's migration routines. As you can see, we are reading in a signed integer J from potentially the attacker. The signed integer goes through several sanity checks, making sure it's not a -1, -2, 0, and making sure it's not greater than the size of the stack allocated variable up there of match batch size. And then we go ahead and read in a large amount of data into that stack variable, except that we don't actually perform a check to see if j is less than 0, resulting in a large amount of data being able to be read into the stack, overflowing that variable and smashing the stack, taking control of the virtual machine monitor. Lastly, we'll talk about some future attacks that may be possible as migration matures and becomes more complex in terms of its functionality, and we'll have a little wrap up. There is a lot more juice in the migration orange. As I said, it's not a very mature technology, and new functions will be added, such as complex load balancing based on resource allocations. There's been some recent work on achieving thermal distribution across the data center by doing many migrations. So all this functionality is going to lead to a lot more increased complexity and, of course, security risk. As I mentioned, if an attacker owns a VMM, they may be able to coerce other VMMs to migrate machines to it, either through forged migration requests or through false resource advertising in the case of load balance systems. An attacker with a compromised VMM can say, oh, I have a ton of resources available, send me all your VMMs, and I promise I'll take very good care of them, while gaining access to all the data within those virtual machines. So the initial response to this is, hey, vendors, why don't you just implement some encryption and authentication for the migrations? And this would be a wonderful thing. Encryption goes a long way in alleviating some of these attacks. Unfortunately, it introduces an additional amount of complexity for key management and the PKI and/or certificate structure that goes along with it. Which hampers the deployability and also the management of these virtualized solutions, which is supposed to be one of the primary advantages of virtualization. And more importantly, this is not currently implemented in the most popular and most widely deployed virtualization solutions such as Xen and VMware. And on a more academic note, even if these encryptions or if these migrations were encrypted, there's still attacks that can be performed. We've seen recently a lot of attacks on variable bitrate encoding streams. For example, you might be able to fingerprint a movie someone's watching based on the encoded movie stream being transferred over the network. We've also seen attacks where the actual language spoken by VoIP conversations can be identified simply based on the encrypted RTP streams. So a similar approach can be taken when it comes to fingerprinting migrations. If you can identify uniquely a virtual machine that's being migrated and you know where it's been migrated to, you may be able to target that location or target the infrastructure supporting that location in a later attack such as denial of service. So this fingerprinting method would be enabled by the iterative pre-copy method, which is a function of the load on the machine and also unique characteristics of that virtual machine and how it actually works. So the official response from VMware is they have two suggestions. The first is to obviously isolation, which you can isolate your migration network from the rest of your network where attackers might have access to. And the other solution is to use hardware-based crypto cards. While both of these are completely valid solutions, it would be great if we would see a software-based solution either in their next iteration of vMotion or Virtual Infrastructure. Virtual Infrastructure 3 is the latest and greatest from VMware, and it is currently vulnerable to these types of attacks. XenSource kind of punted on the issue, saying that you should contact your vendor or Linux distribution for the associated security enhancements to the migration process. It really seems like they're hanging their open source release out to dry. I don't know if this is a product of their acquisition by Citrix, but I'm not going to speculate on that. And I'm currently unsure of the migration functionality in the Xen Server 4, which is their non-open source version of this. I haven't got my hands on that, mostly because it's not free. It'll be really interesting to see when Microsoft releases their Hyper-V virtual machine monitor, what approach they take on this whole migration functionality. If they learn from the mistakes of the previous vendors, and if they actually get it right the first time. It looks like a pretty cool technology, so it'll be interesting to see what exactly happens when it's released. And if we take a step back and look at the big picture, we know that virtual machine migration is very useful functionality. And if you're deploying virtualization within your enterprise or organization right now, and you're not using migration, it's only a matter of time before you will be, due to the great benefits that it provides. these enterprises and organizations that are deploying this need to be aware of the security risks that are involved in such a deployment due to the further breaking down of these isolation barriers that we've been used to having. And the vendors need to provide better access control, isolation, and authentication routines to help mitigate the attacks that could be possible on these migrations. And until that happens, we know that these are rather severe weaknesses in systems that are deployed pretty extensively throughout enterprises and financial institutions and organizations, and can be an extremely valuable weapon in the arsenal of an attacker or a legitimate pen tester. At this time, I'll open it up for any questions. Sure.
Do any things here apply to the stop copy?
Yes, all of the attacks apply to pretty much every.
Stop copy or
Yeah, it would be, and in theory, it would be more difficult to perform such an attack against a demand migration, since you would only be seeing one page being transferred over the network at a time, and it would be harder for an attacker to identify what that page belonged to, and also modify more parts of contiguous memory just based on that one page.
The other thing you mentioned is being on top of basically Unix boxes. What about they started putting VM on is available on COS or mainframes?
Mm-hmm.
This is supply that does.
I haven't had any experience with those. I mean, virtualization and even some migration techniques date back to the 60s and 70s. But the stuff that's at least coming out now from the mainstream vendors such as VMware and Zen have been employing these vulnerable things. So if you're using a different platform or a different hypervisor, it's possible that these concerns are alleviated by that vendor, but it's also possible that they may be vulnerable to the same attacks. Anybody else? All right, thanks a lot then. Oh wait, one more.
Well, this is almost on topic. We're hearing a lot of vendors that tell us that they can do access control by bringing up a virtual session or a virtual machine that lets you sign users on and off network. Is there any reason that thing's not just as vulnerable?
Do you mean like application streaming, such as like Citrix provides, or?
Like Citrix provides, or just plain user access control where they're setting up a single sign-on inside its own virtual machine and then dropping the machine?
I don't quite understand the question.
Well, is there any reason that those sessions are any less vulnerable to what you're talking about?
Not necessarily. I know that Citrix application streaming, and that stuff's been around for a while, and a couple of people I know that work at Citrix say that these application streaming sessions, or these sessions where people log on and use applications remotely, are pretty well authenticated.
Is your SensePoint tool available, or is it something that people post on?
Yeah, I can make it available. Just shoot me an email. My contact information is right there, and I can provide you with a copy with it. All right, thanks a lot.